In the winter of 1349, in a stone chamber beneath the church of Santa Maria in Trastevere, an elderly Swedish woman woke from what witnesses described as a sleep that was not sleep. Her body had been cold for 3 hours. The priests attending her had already begun preparations for last rites. One had checked her pulse twice, nothing. Her confessor, a Franciscan named Brother Paolo, later wrote in his private journal that he had seen death enough times to know its signs, and Bridget of Sweden had crossed that threshold. Then her eyes opened. What she described in the hours that followed would be copied in secret, passed between monasteries in locked boxes, and eventually hidden in the Vatican archives under a classification that remains sealed to this day. Not because the church doubted her, because they believed her completely. And what she saw at the moment of death terrified them. Bridget didn't speak immediately. According to Brother Paolo's account, she stared at the ceiling for 7 minutes without blinking, tears streaming down her face, her lips moving in what looked like silent argument with someone no one else could see. When she finally spoke, her first words were not about heaven. They were a question. Why are they not told? The room held 4 people, 2 priests, a nun from her order, and a papal secretary who had been summoning to document anything she might say in her final hours. All 4 would later give sworn testimony about what happened next, and their accounts match in every detail. Bridget sat up, which shouldn't have been possible given her condition. She looked directly at the papal secretary and said, "Write this exactly. Do not soften it. Do not interpret it. The souls are drowning because no one warns them what happens in the 3 seconds after the heart stops." 3 seconds. Not 3 minutes. Not 3 hours. 3 seconds. She described it like this. The soul does not drift peacefully. It is ripped, like a child pulled from a mother's arms in a crowd. And in those 3 seconds, while the body still holds warmth, a question is asked that most souls are not prepared to answer. The papal secretary's hand was shaking so badly that the ink splattered. He would later tell the Vatican investigators that he felt an oppressive weight in the room, as if the air itself had become solid. Bridget continued, her voice steady but urgent. "I was shown 1,000 deaths, not one, 1,000. I saw merchants and queens, priests and farmers, children and soldiers. And the question asked of each soul was the same." She paused. The nun attending her later wrote that Bridget's eyes seemed to be looking through the walls, seeing something vast and terrible. The question is not, "Did you believe?" It is not, "Were you good?" Those come later in the judgment so many speak of. The first question, the one asked while your body still holds the memory of breathing, is this: "What did you love more than me?" The room went silent. Brother Paolo, who had heard thousands of confessions and considered himself unshakable, wrote that he felt his stomach drop, because he understood immediately what Bridget meant. Not what did you love, what did you love more? And here's where the revelation becomes truly disturbing. Bridget said that in those 3 seconds, the soul cannot lie. Not to God, not to itself. The answer appears not in words but in images, a cascade of moments from the person's life playing simultaneously. And the soul sees, with perfect clarity, every time it chose something else over God. Not evil things necessarily. Not always sin in the dramatic sense. Sometimes it was comfort. Sometimes it was reputation. Sometimes it was safety or control or the good opinion of others. One woman Bridget saw in her vision had been considered saintly by her community. She attended daily mass, served the poor, prayed the rosary without fail. But when her soul was ripped from her body and the 3 seconds began, the images that appeared were of a daughter she had smothered with expectations, a husband she had controlled with guilt, and a secret pride that had poisoned every good work. She had loved her own righteousness more than God. And she knew it. In those 3 seconds, she knew. Bridget said the woman's soul let out a sound that had no earthly equivalent, not a scream, something worse. The sound of a soul realizing it, built its entire life on sand, and the tide has come. But this wasn't even the terrifying part. The papal secretary asked Bridget if these souls were lost, if those 3 seconds determined eternal damnation. Her answer has been debated by theologians for 7 centuries. She said, "The 3 seconds do not determine the judgment. They determine whether the soul is ready to receive the judgment." Think about that distinction. A soul unprepared for that question, a soul that has never honestly examined what it truly loved, enters the rest of death in a state of shock. And Bridget was shown that this shock, this sudden confrontation with self-knowledge that was avoided in life, creates a kind of spiritual paralysis. She used a specific word that the papal secretary wrote in Latin, stupor animae, the stupor of the soul. And here's what makes this warning so urgent. Bridget claimed that most souls, even faithful ones, enter death in this state of stupor because they spent their lives performing religion without ever confronting the deeper question. They prayed, but never asked themselves if they loved prayer or loved God. They served, but never examined whether they loved serving or loved being seen as servants. They believed, but never tested whether they loved truth or loved the comfort of belief. Brother Paulo's journal contains a passage he wrote 3 days after Bridget's revelation. He had gone to pray in the chapel alone at night, and he wrote, "I asked myself the question, what do I love more than God? And I was horrified to discover I could not answer immediately. 23 years as a priest, and I did not know." He spent the next week in fasting and silence, going through his life methodically, examining his motives for every major decision. What he found, he wrote, made him weep. "I became a priest because my family expected it. I served the poor because it earned me respect. I prayed because I feared hell, not because I loved heaven. And tonight, I realized that if I died tomorrow, those 3 seconds would destroy me, not because I was wicked, but because I was never honest." This is the warning Bridget brought back. Not that God is cruel, not that judgment is arbitrary, but that death asks a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding, and the answer appears in 3 seconds, whether we're ready or not. But she saw something else in her vision, something the church found almost as disturbing as the warning itself. She saw what happens to souls who are ready, and it was stranger than anyone expected. Bridget described a merchant from Genoa who died suddenly in his warehouse. He was not particularly religious. He attended Mass irregularly, confessed perhaps twice a year, gave to the poor but not extravagantly. By most measures, an ordinary Christian. But when his soul was torn from his body and the 3 seconds began, something different happened. The question was asked, "What did you love more than me?" And the images that cascaded through his soul were odd, small moments. A morning he had given his breakfast to a beggar and gone hungry, not because anyone was watching, but because the beggar's eyes had moved him. An afternoon, he had closed his shop early to sit with his dying father, losing significant money simply because presence mattered more. A night he had wept in prayer, not asking for anything, just overcome by the beauty of existence, scattered moments, inconsistent, not enough to make him a saint by any official measure. But when the 3 seconds ended, Bridget said his soul gave a different sound, not the wail of realization, a gasp of recognition, as if he had been walking in fog his entire life and suddenly saw the sun. The papal secretary pressed her on this. What made him different? Bridget's answer was simple and devastating. He never pretended, not to God, not to himself. When he was selfish, he knew he was selfish. When he was generous, he didn't congratulate himself. He lived honestly, even in his failures. So when the question came, his soul was not shocked. It was ready. This is the part that the Vatican found almost heretical, though they couldn't articulate why. Because what Bridget was suggesting was that spiritual readiness had less to do with the quantity of good works and more to do with a quality of self-awareness that the Church rarely taught. She was saying that a soul that knows itself, even in its ugliness, is more prepared for death than a soul that has built a beautiful facade. One of the priests in the room asked her directly, "Are you saying that sinners who are honest fare better than righteous people who are not?" Bridget closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, she said, "I am saying that the 3 seconds reveal the truth." And a soul that has been practicing truth in life, even painful truth, is not destroyed by that revelation. A soul that has been practicing deception, even holy deception, is shattered. The nun who was present, Sister Margarita, wrote later that this statement caused an argument among the clergy that lasted for hours. Because if Bridget was right, then much of what the Church taught about preparation for death was incomplete. It wasn't enough to confess sins. It wasn't enough to do penance. It wasn't even enough to die in a state of grace. A soul had to know itself. And most people, Bridget said, die as strangers to themselves. The Vatican's response to this revelation was complicated. They didn't condemn it. They didn't promote it. They simply buried it, not maliciously, but carefully. The official records show that Bridget's vision was investigated by a team of theologians over the course of 6 months. Their conclusion, written in carefully neutral language, stated that her vision was not contrary to faith, but also not necessary for the faithful to know, which is ecclesiastical language for, this is true, but we don't know what to do with it. Because if they taught this widely, if they told every Christian that death begins with 3 seconds of unavoidable self-confrontation, it would change everything. Confession would need to be taught differently. Prayer would need to be approached differently. The entire framework of spiritual preparation would need to shift from external performance to internal honesty. And the Church in the 14th century was not equipped for that shift. So the warning was preserved but not preached, copied but not distributed, discussed among mystics and scholars but kept from the common faithful. Brother Paolo's journal suggests this was a mistake. He wrote, "We think we are protecting souls by not frightening them, but we are sending them to death unprepared. Better a soul that fears the 3 seconds in life than a soul that faces them in shock at death." 3 months after Bridget's vision, Brother Paolo died in his sleep. His fellow Franciscans found him in his cell, face peaceful, hands folded. But on his desk was a piece of parchment with a single sentence written over and over, filling the entire page. "I loved you, I loved you, I loved you, I loved you," as if he was practicing his answer. Now here's where Bridget's warning becomes more than historical curiosity. Because she didn't just describe what happens at death, she described how to prepare for those 3 seconds while still alive. And her method was not what the Church expected. She told the papal secretary, "Write this for those who come after. The preparation for the 3 seconds is not more prayer, it is not more fasting, it is not more service. Those things are good, but they do not prepare the soul for the question." He waited, quill ready. The preparation is this. Every night before sleep, ask yourself the question, what did I love more than God today? And answer honestly. Not what you should have loved, what you actually loved. Write it down if you must. Speak it aloud in an empty room. Confess it to a priest, but name it. She paused, and here her voice became urgent, almost desperate. Most souls die without ever asking this question in life. So when it is asked at death, they have no practice answering. They have spent 70 years avoiding it, and then suddenly they have 3 seconds. The nun Sister Margarita asked the obvious question. But what if the answer is always the same? What if every night I realize I loved comfort more than God, safety more than God, myself more than God? Does that not lead to despair? Bridget smiled for the first time since waking. It was, witnesses said, a sad smile but somehow gentle. No, it leads to truth. And truth, even painful truth, is the only preparation the soul needs. Because the 3 seconds do not ask for perfection, they ask for honesty. A soul that has been honest about its failures every day is not destroyed when those failures appear in death. It recognizes them. And recognition is the beginning of mercy. This is the part that was most heavily debated, because traditional teaching emphasized contrition, amendment of life, the sacraments as means of grace. And Bridget wasn't denying any of that. But she was adding something the Church had not emphasized, the necessity of unflinching self-knowledge. You could confess your sins weekly and still be unprepared for death if you never truly examined why you committed them. You could receive communion daily and still be shattered by the 3 seconds if you never asked what you loved more than the God you were receiving. The practice she was describing was psychological before psychology existed, spiritual therapy before therapy was invented, daily confrontation with the truth of your own heart. Brother Paolo tried this practice for the remaining months of his life. His journal documents the process, and it's startling to read. The first week, his answers were surface level. I loved food more than God today because I ate when not hungry. I love sleep more than God because I skipped morning prayer. But by the second week, he was going deeper. I loved control more than God because I corrected Brother Thomas harshly, not for his good, but to reassert my authority. By the fourth week, I loved being right more than God because I argued theology with the visiting priest not to seek truth, but to display my learning. By the eighth week, I loved myself more than God because even my acts of charity are performances I watch myself give, and I am always the hero of my own story. The progression is devastating to read. Here was a man considered holy by his community, and he was discovering in himself layers of self-deception that his religious practice had never touched. But his final entries show something else, not despair, a kind of lightness. He wrote, I am beginning to understand what Bridget meant. The truth does not crush me as I feared. It frees me, because I am no longer pretending, not even to myself. And when I pray now, I'm not praying as the person I wish I were. I'm praying as the person I actually am, and somehow that prayer reaches deeper. This was the mercy Bridget spoke of. Not that God excuses our failures, but that God meets us in the truth of them, and a soul practiced in that meeting is ready for the 3 seconds. But there's a darker element to Bridget's vision that the church really didn't want known. She saw what happens to souls who are not just unprepared, but actively self-deceived. And it's worse than anything taught about hell. Bridget described souls who had built entire identities around religious performance, priests who loved the priesthood more than God, nobles who loved their charitable reputation more than the poor they served, mystics who loved their mystical experiences more than the God who gave them. When these souls faced the 3 seconds, the images that appeared were not of obvious sins. They were of holy actions done for unholy reasons, masses celebrated for applause, prayers offered for spiritual pride, fasts performed for self-control rather than surrender. And Bridget said these souls experienced something she called the second death, not physical death, not even the death of the body, but the death of the false self they had spent their lives constructing. She described it as watching yourself dissolve. Every carefully constructed identity, every polished virtue, every spiritual achievement revealed as hollow, and beneath it all, a stranger, the true self you never met because you were too busy building the false one. The papal secretary noted that Bridget wept when describing this, not because God was cruel, but because these souls had wasted their entire lives creating a person who didn't exist, and death revealed the loss. Imagine, she said, spending 70 years building a house stone by stone, believing you were building a cathedral, and then in 3 seconds you see that every stone was hollow and the whole structure collapses, and you are left standing in ruins. And only now do you see the cathedral you were supposed to build. But your life is over. This is why the church suppressed this part of the revelation. It was too destabilizing, because it suggested that religious people, perhaps especially religious people, were at risk of the worst form of spiritual catastrophe, dying without ever meeting their true selves. But Bridget insisted this warning be preserved. She told the priests, "Do not protect people from this truth. The terror of hearing it in life is mercy compared to the terror of discovering it at death." One of the theologians who examined her vision wrote in his report, "If what she describes is true, then we must reconsider how we prepare souls for death. We have taught them to fear sin. We have not taught them to fear self-deception. And according to Bridget, self-deception is the greater danger." The report was filed. Nothing changed, or almost nothing. In certain monasteries, particularly among the Franciscans and later the Carmelites, a practice developed quietly. No official rule, no papal approval, just a tradition passed from confessor to penitent. The practice of the 3-second examination. Every night before sleep, ask the question, "What did I love more than God today?" and sit with the answer, no matter how uncomfortable, until you can say it aloud honestly. St. John of the Cross would later reference this practice, though he never named Bridget directly. St. Teresa of Avila taught a version of it to her nuns. St. Ignatius of Loyola built it into his examination of conscience, though he softened the language. But the core question remained: what do you love more than God? And the core purpose, to practice in life the moment you will face in death, because 3 seconds is not long enough to start learning honesty. Now, the question that should be hammering in your mind: is this vision binding? Must Catholics believe this? No. Private revelation, even from canonized saints, is never binding on the faithful. The Church approves certain visions as worthy of belief, but never demands belief. Bridget's vision of the 3 seconds falls into this category: investigated, not condemned, preserved, but not preached. But here's what is binding, what is official church teaching: you will be judged. The particular judgment happens immediately after death, and that judgment is based on the state of your soul and the truth of your life. Bridget's vision simply describes how that judgment begins. And whether you believe her specific details or not, the underlying truth is unavoidable. Death will reveal what you actually loved, not what you said you loved, not what you tried to love, what you actually loved. That revelation is coming for every person who has ever lived. The only question is whether it will be a shock or a recognition. Brother Paulo's final journal entry, written the day before he died, contains this paragraph: I asked myself the question tonight, as I have every night since Bridget's warning: what did I love more than God today? And for the first time, I could not think of anything, not because I achieved perfection, but because I finally stopped performing my life and started living it. I failed in small ways, yes, but I failed honestly. And tonight, I am not afraid of the 3 seconds. Because I have been practicing my answer for 3 months, and my answer is simply this: I tried to love you above all things. I failed often, but I tried, and I never lied to myself about it. He died in his sleep that night. His brothers found the journal open on his desk and delivered it to Bridget as he had requested. She read it, wept, and then added a single line in the margin: he is ready. This is the gift Bridget's vision offers. Not terror, though the warning is terrifying, but preparation. 3 seconds is not long, but a lifetime of honest 3-second examinations can make those final 3 seconds bearable, even joyful, because a soul that knows itself is a soul that can be known by God without shame. And that, Bridget insisted, is what the 3 seconds are ultimately about. Not punishment, not even judgment in the vindictive sense, but the final stripping away of all pretense, all performance, all facade, leaving only what is real. And if what is real has been shaped by honesty, even brutal honesty, then those 3 seconds become not a trial, but a homecoming. The soul sees itself truly, perhaps for the first time, and in that seeing, it sees God, and recognizes that it was loved all along, not for the person it pretended to be, but for the person it actually was. This is what the merchant from Genoa experienced, not because he was perfect, but because he was real. And reality, Bridget said, is the only thing that survives death. Everything else burns away in 3 seconds. The question you must ask yourself tonight, and every night until death comes, is this: what survives when everything burns away? What do you love more than God? Answer honestly. You're practicing for the most important 3 seconds of your existence.